everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome you to today's ATI seminar featuring Dr. Forsythe, who will be speaking on the topic, a new legislative framework for donation in the UK. Before introducing Dr. Forsythe, I would like to acknowledge that the University of Alberta is located on Treaty 6 territory. As settlers, we aspire to respect the histories, languages, and cultures of First Nations, Métis, Inuit, and all First Peoples of Canada, whose presence enriches our shared community. I'd also like to acknowledge Paladin for their support of this seminar series and remind those present to please register for the ATI Research Day, which is being held June 20 to 21st. So it is now my pleasure to present Dr. Forsythe. Dr. John Forsythe was an abdominal transplant surgeon for over 30 years and has been a clinical director of the program in Edinburgh before taking up the role of medical director for the UK. Professor Forsythe has recently stepped down from the post as medical director for organ and tissue donation and transplantation in NHS blood and transplant, a position that he held through the pandemic, leading a team of senior clinicians and managers to support and sustain donation, retrieval, and transplant services across the whole of the UK. Dr. Forsythe has held multiple administrative lead positions, the chair of the Scottish Transplant Group, chair of the Advisory Committee for Safety of Blood Tissues and Organs, board member of the Arm's Length body at its inauguration as NHS Blood and Transplant. He's also held professional leadership positions, including but not limited to past president of the British Transplantation Society, past president of the European Society of Transplantation, and UK representative to the EU Specialist Expert Group on Transplantation. I'm going to truncate your biography there, recognizing I'd like to turn it over to you to talk now, Dr. Forsythe. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's great having all of that as an introduction. Thank you very much, but I still can't work Zoom. What's going on? No, I'm sorry for the technical problems. I mean, obviously I've used Zoom hundreds of times and I don't know what was going on today. So obviously some breakdown in connection and I apologize for that. To whoever's moving the slides on, just to be aware that I will, within slides, I'll often ask for a next click as well, please, because there's quite a lot of that in the slides. So if you can just be alive to that, that would be really good. Thank you very much indeed. So as has been introduced, I've been asked to talk about the introduction of opt-out into the UK, and many thanks for that invite. I'm very aware that in Canada and in the UK, we have worked closely together on many transplant projects. So it's a delight to come and talk to you about this. And I know that you are considering changes as well. And therefore, it's important to share the knowledge that we have, as we often do in transplantation. So context, first of all. So the UK population, as you see here, around 68 million. And most people know that, of course, the UK is made up of the four main countries: Wales, England, Scotland, Northern Ireland. And click, please. And the main bit of the population is actually within England, of course, nearly 58 million of that in England. And again, please click. But also there are these things called crown dependencies, Isle of Man and other islands, which actually have their own parliaments or similar to parliaments. And that's important when we talk about legislation change. And more context, next click, please. The context of religion in the UK shows that it's mainly still a Christian country, but actually, as you see there, an increasing secular trend as time goes on. Next slide, please. And if we now cone down on donation and transplantation, of that 68 million, around 680,000 deaths across the UK, 380,000 of those hospital deaths, and only 7,000 odd occur in situations where potential donation is possible. And as you see, that comes down to about 1,100 donors in the end, with the mixture or the breakdown between DBD and DCD, as you see there, with around 3,000 patients transplanted every year in the UK. Next, please. So, as I say, many of you in Canada are aware of the changes that we've made in the UK in the last number of years. And the two major changes really that we might point to are in 2008, the Organ Donation Task Force making changes to the infrastructure of the way that donation and transplant runs. And then 2020, another push towards consent. Next click, please. And you'll see that the task force did a lot, brought in, if you like, the specialist nurses for organ donation, the so-called SNODs, and also importantly, the clinical leads for organ donation in every ICU across the UK. And then taking organ transplantation to 2020 increased public awareness, improved the infrastructure further, and also began to pivot a little bit towards organ utilization, which we've done much more of in the last year or so. Next slide, please. So I think this is important. Obviously, this is percentage, and this is important perhaps for you as I think you're talking about referral issues. And you will see that the changes that were brought about, both in terms of referral, in terms of the number of donors, and in terms of the consent, was really quite important in terms of the changes that occurred. But you can see that there is, to some extent, a little bit of a plateauing off, particularly in consent issues towards 2017, 18, 19. Next slide, please. Now, anybody who's ever listened to somebody from the UK talk will know that, that this is often a slide shown where you'll see in blue the number of donors, in red the number of transplants, and in green the line shows the waiting list numbers. And you'll see that whilst donor numbers rose, that transplant numbers haven't really risen in exactly the same way. And indeed, there has been a plateauing out in the fall in waiting lists in the last few years. Next slide, please. So what's the challenge? The challenge that legislation change tried to fix, click again, please, was this, that for a while, the number of deceased organ donors increased, then plateaued, and then of course, we hit COVID. And no talk at the moment is complete without reference to that. And next slide, please. I think it's important that we do note this and the changes that went on, and every picture does indeed tell a story, because here you have in black the number of transplants week by week throughout the last 2 years. And in what blue stroke turquoise, you've got this, or purpley sort of color, you've got the number of donors. And you'll see what happened, particularly during the first lockdown. And you'll see also the dramatic response of the clinical community in terms of getting ourselves organized across the country and reacting in terms of the number of transplants that were carried out, indeed a record number for the summer months. And you'll see that it's taken us a while to get back towards normal again, but you'll also see that in the last couple of weeks that there has been a rise back to levels that we have seen in the past. Next, please. But get back to opting out. What happened in Wales, which was 2015, the first country that introduced an opt-out clause, an opt-out legislation? Well, there was greater public awareness. There was good clinical confidence in the Welsh system anyway, with a single Welsh transplant unit. And you could say that the summary would be the following. Next, please. First of all, the paper that's been published on this in anesthesia, and I'll go into the detail of that in just a minute, if I may. Next. And then, you know, I like the sort of statistics that you can just eyeball. You don't need the sort of data that you don't need statistics for. You can just eyeball because you can see here the consent rate in Wales, the change that there was between 2014-15 and 2018-19, with similar figures shown in England, Scotland, and Northern Ireland, and donors per million population likewise over that period. Next, please. So that paper that I referred to, there was a very complex statistical analysis comparing the Welsh consent rate with the English consent rate. And as you see here, the DBD comparison demonstrates that as those dots cross that upper line, that in fact you can then say that there is a statistically significant difference between Wales and England. And of course, the only real difference, because they are so similar in everything else that they do, was the change in legislation. So it suggested that indeed the consent rate has improved, but you'll also see that it took some time to do so. And in that paper, there hadn't been a change in the DCD consent rate, although I can update that with saying that the most recent analysis has demonstrated that there is a statistically significant difference between the two countries that are very closely in geography. Next slide, please. And I just want to say that one of the most important things that people must think about, I think, is that the legislation change in itself as a flick of a switch is not enough. There really needs to be very, very clear public relations that goes alongside it. And here is one of the ads that was used in Wales, which I think is an extremely strong ad. And I think it does demonstrate the sort of thing that needs to be done as legislation changes. The change itself is not enough. Click, please.
I've made my decision on organ donation, and I say...
Don't you touch him, he's my son!
After all, it's important that...
Dad? No!
And I really want everyone to know.
I'm his wife, I don't care what it says on his record.
Last year, more than 60 life-changing transplants didn't happen because the families of organ donors in Wales overruled their decision. So talk about organ donation.
Or someone else may speak for you.
Okay, so I hope you've now got the feeling that as deemed consent legislation came in the UK, there were a number of different sort of, if you like, nuanced differences between the different countries in terms of the deemed consent, even called different name, deemed consent, deemed authorization in Scotland, and some minor differences. But overall, it was largely the same idea in terms of opting out legislation. But I'll go into the detail of exactly what was introduced in a minute or two. Next slide, please. It's fair to say that there was a sort of, if you like, a rollout of the legislation. And it was another feature of it that in fact, if you like, the emotional side of donation and transplantation was acknowledged in the legislation, in that the laws were named after particular individuals. It started off with Max, who is the young lad that you see with the median sternotomy in the middle there. And Max received a heart transplant, and he came into the attention of the public when he was on the waiting list. He's an extraordinary young man, a very articulate young man, and he served as an incredible ambassador for organ donation and transplantation. And initially it was going to be called Max's Law. I'm delighted to say that actually it was called Max and Kira's Law, because Kira tragically was the donor and donated her heart to Max. And both Max and his family and Kira's family were at the British Transplant Society meeting, and they all spoke, and it was a very emotional affair as that law was changed. But as I say, it is not enough simply to change the law in the Parliament and think that that's enough to be done. The UK was built on a very strong foundation. Next slide, please. The foundation was of a UK framework. Click again, please. which really, this is not my quote, but I think it's true that after the organ donation task force, there was a very strong ethical, legal, and professional framework that underpinned deceased donation. Next click, please. And there have been a huge amount of work. There's been a huge amount of work done to take that further and to, if you like, establish a good foundation for the legislation to then be built upon. Next slide, please. So what was different? So what changed? So if I talk about England and Wales here, we talk about the breaking bad news and the approach to the family, unchanged, straightforward as before. Step 2, the specialist nurse or the specialist requester will establish if an express decision had been made by the donor, so on the organ donor register or verbally to family. If not, next click, please. Then step 3 was that the specialist nurse will decide whether or not consent can be deemed. What do we mean by that? Next slide, please. We mean that in the context of England and Wales, that this is the top end statement that you like, but if you like, but this is also a list of the excluded groups. Next, please. And again, please. Yeah, that's it. So the list of those who are excluded, but otherwise deemed consent will apply. And I'm happy to answer any questions on this when we get to the Q&A. Next slide, please. So back to our step-by-step follow through. Next, please. And I think this is quite important because the step 4 was that the specialist nurse will return to the family and establish the discussion with the family. And I think that's quite important because obviously it's a soft form of opt-out, if you like. It does change, though, the tone and the approach of the specialist nurse to the family because it allows the approach to be, in these circumstances, this is what we would normally do, and this is what the law suggests. And that really, according to our experts and our specialist nurses, is that has changed the way that approach can be taken and taken further. Next, please. It also relies upon the fact that the change in legislation was built on the Human Tissue. The Human Tissue Act in England was 2004, in Scotland 2006, and there is a hierarchy established. So if there is dispute in the family, that is dealt with by the hierarchy to a certain extent. I think that again is an important foundation when legislation is being changed in this way. Next, please. So in the last few minutes, maybe just to talk about the challenges and benefits of introducing opt-out. And I think there are a few of those that we have learned along the way. Next slide, please. The first is the legislative process means that we have engaged our politicians. And what has been good here is that we have engaged politicians across all colors, if you like, in terms of party colors. What we've been able to do is to see that there was, particularly in some of the parliaments, a cross-party backing to this going ahead, and parliamentarians saw that the response to a public consultation was incredible. It's what it is a thing that people feel strongly about. As you see, normally a consultation in Parliament gets about 200 responses. This got 17,000. Next, please. The other thing that we found was that we needed our specialist nurses to be very highly trained and retrieval teams in the new legislation. As you can imagine, it was being introduced across the UK, but it was introduced in different timings in different countries. And although largely because we were working with legislators, largely it was very similar from one country to another. I did mention the nuanced differences in the legislation, and therefore it was very important that the operational readiness was in place, so that there was no confusion. And so there was an education process for specialist nurses across the UK as the legislation changed. Next, please. I think this is one of the biggest benefits of the legislation. And there were times, because of the odd way in which legislation was introduced in the English Parliament with its long history, there were times, even right up to the end, that the opt-out legislation might have fallen. And I often said that even if it did, there would be huge benefits, because we had spoken to faith groups and belief groups and community groups to a much greater extent. And also, I think it was seen by those faith groups, belief groups, and community groups that actually we were prepared to do things that addressed some of the concerns and the loss of trust that had happened. And for instance, we were prepared to produce digitally those cards that you see, which were faith specific. And that dialogue improved the relationship between us as a donation and transplant organization with the different groups. And it also meant that when we ran into some problems as the legislation changed, we were able to not respond necessarily ourselves alone, but also asked the faith and belief groups to do the response themselves. And they were very happy to do that. Next slide, please. So another thing that is pointed at opt-out legislation is that it changes the feel of donation. It changes the gift of donation. And all we can say is that from Wales and from our early experience in some other parts of the UK, there is no evidence that it does change the gift aspect. So here's a quote from one of the first deemed consent families in Wales. Click, please. And I think that speaks for itself. But I think it's also important that we do learn that we should not take the gift aspect of donation for granted. And indeed, around this aspect of donation, colleagues have built different structures. Click again, please, including the fact that there are, if you like, recognition of the donation, whether that be by small gifts or by the Order of St. John Award, which is held around the UK, and donor families attend that. And it's, if you like, hosted by the specialist nurses and the regional teams for organ donation and transplantation. Next, please. There were other ancillary benefits. There was a new app introduced around the time of the pandemic, and we rode on the back of that and tried to encourage people to think about organ donation and to easily register either support or not on the organ donor register. So I think it was, if you like, ancillary, but it was something that allowed us to make sure that even in modern communication, this was possible. Next, please. But I would stress again, and I'm really sorry that ad did not play properly, because I think it did illustrate the importance of the PR campaign that goes alongside. And I think we regularly, not only did we run the campaign, we also checked very carefully to see if the campaign had a good reach. And click again, please. Good awareness, and again, please. And also whether people had gone on and had discussion. And we had, if you like, targets for that campaign. So I think it is very important that we underline that doing the change in legislation alone is not enough. Next, please. Can I just share with you before we do this benefits and collaboration, can I just share with you that the strapline for our PR campaign in England was the law is changing, pass it on. Now, when we suddenly realized that the PR campaign was running during, it was actually introduced during the pandemic, we thought that pass it on was maybe not the best thing for a strapline to say, and we had to rapidly change our focus. As I've said to you, I think the introduction of the legislation across Parliament, patient groups, NHS, faith groups, regulators that I haven't mentioned yet, media, a lot of media got behind this, and we also involved ethicists in this. I think the collaborative effort was huge and is still felt in various parts of the UK now. And I think I've also underlined to you that once you change the legislation, you have to be patient. It may not change the data for some time. Next, please. But just to say that now these figures may be punctured slightly by the pandemic because they are projections pre-pandemic, but we were hoping that if we followed what we had seen in Wales, that we might see significantly more transplants in the next few years. And of course, that is what we are all aiming for. Next slide, please. Can I just close by saying huge thank you. I think I demonstrated the opt-out implementation team across the UK was both expert and also quite a large number of people, and also to all of those people who helped us introduce that new legislation.
Hi, thanks so much, John. That was it's such great information, and the way the story is told and the way it comes together, including that ad. I have seen that ad, and it's really very effective. My question to you is, can you talk a little bit about mandatory referral, how your referral of potential of individuals who might need to be thought about, could be thought about, where donation might be a process that would affect them. How is that managed at the moment?
Yeah, and so there isn't, we don't have mandatory referral. I think one of the graphs, I don't know whether you saw, Laurie, one of the graphs did demonstrate that when we first started in the organ donation task force around 2008, I think the referral, when we went back and looked at the potential donor audit, we found that the referral rate was only around 60%. So of those who would be potential donors, it was around 60%. Now it's with the specialist nurses going back to ICUs on a regular basis, with the embedded clinical leads, the doctors that have a duty, if you like, to look after the donation aspect within ICUs. You probably saw that it's raised to anything between 92 and actually I think there was a few months where it was actually up at 99, 100%. And that's across the whole of the UK. So that's been a big change. And it's interesting because it was done without saying it should be mandatory. It was done by changing the culture, really, from being, it was something that was expected to something that was simply a part of the end of life care. Now, that sounds very soft. I guess there is also a slightly harder aspect in the background as well, in that I know that in regular ICU, if you like, meetings, M&M meetings, those sort of things, that if a potential donor has not been referred, a specialist nurse will, if you like, flag that, or the clinical lead will flag it, and there will be a review. And all of the major ICUs will then say, well, why was that donor referred? And why didn't we? And without finger pointing, it will be said that that would be expected to be referred in the future. And I think it's an interesting way of doing it. It's not making it mandatory, but I guess by embedding it in normal clinical practice and having, to a certain extent, a soft inspectorate, if you allow me to characterize it like that, I think that has made a difference.
Well, clearly impressive numbers, and maybe the whole issue of the SNOD, the specialist nurse in organ donation, that those specialist requesters as well must have clearly had an impact, because that's been shown in a number of jurisdictions, I think, but really led by the UK, hasn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks.
In listening to your presentation, I was struck by the amount of political engagement. As physicians, many of us enjoy public engagement, but we don't always enjoy political engagement, particularly when the political landscape is often shifting and there seems to be variable trust in different political leaders. I recognize right now in Canada, there is quite a great deal of polarization when it comes to political alliances and trust within particular political parties. Do you have any thoughts on how one engages in legislative change in such a landscape where politics are polarized?
Yeah, politics are very polarized here as well, and yeah, your use of the word enjoy. Did I enjoy it? Yeah, we'll see. But I think it's necessary. I honestly think it's necessary. I think the truth is that once you get a number of parliamentarians to take this on as a cause, then it clearly does make a difference, and so I think us pretending that it doesn't and pretending that we can do it all through simply public and media, I think that's not true. So there was a lot of work that went into it. I mean, I can remember going, for instance, you'll probably know enough of the parliamentary system in the UK to know that there are two houses, and the House of Lords is the sort of the secondary house, if you like. But there was the possibility, because of the way in which the bill was introduced, that the House of Lords could have killed the bill. And they would have done that for what they all thought was the right reasons. I sat down with 11 different lords and ladies of the House of Lords to talk through their issues. And it eventually got through the House of Lords. So I think you do have to make that engagement. Sometimes you see the best of politicians, because I think there are some people who are idealists out there who are trying to do the best thing. Sometimes you don't, but you have to engage.
Thank you. Are there other comments or questions? I
have another question. There's an interesting, I noticed you had in your slide some interesting dialogue between language between deemed consent and presumed. The wording in the laws is a little bit different, and we've been asked before how does that work? How is one deemed versus presumed?
Yeah, I think it was actually, I think it was a wordsmith who was a civil servant in Wales who first came up with deemed. I think if you talk to ethicists, Laurie, you often, there's a whole thing about the presumed consent, which people talk about as being an oxymoron, really. So presumed consent isn't good. Opt-out has very negative connotations to it. And so, actually, I think the deemed consent is very accurate language. And I think when Wales adopted it, it was then adopted elsewhere. Scotland don't like consent. They say that consent, again, some of the ethicists within Scotland, I think, and some of the legislators talked about the fact that consent consent requires information and informed consent. And sort of by definition, you're not always giving all of the information. You're making a decision without all of the information, even though that's still a valid decision. And so we have ended up with deemed authorization in Scotland. So these nuances are there, and I suppose, you know, the benefits of the system allowing that nuance without necessarily mandating a change across the whole of the UK has been quite good in that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's very interesting from the perspective of the various kind of ethical dialogue that we've heard, and the concept of self and information and so on. So it's very interesting that they've taken these nuances into account.
May I ask in Alberta, and I realize there is a sort of a different from one province to another. Is there a push towards a legislative change, and is it about mandatory referral rather than deemed consent?
Yes, it's not. So it's not a consent. The current legislation that's being looked at right now is not about consent or any particular consent model, but it does bring into play some structural changes in the system. And from what I've seen from your presentations and from others in other jurisdictions, the actual system changes that streamline the process of it have made enormous. Have been described as having enormous impact. So mandatory referral of potential donors is one of those. Some structural changes in how the whole provincial approach is organized are being considered, as well as there are differences in how systems report through health authorities and so on. So it's really some of those issues that are currently underway. We do have an organ registry in Alberta that was established a number of years ago.
Okay. I mean, I would just stress that, as I said, our discussions and our communication and building up a relationship with faith and belief groups was so important. I mean, because as the legislation was introduced, as you'll be aware, there was social media nonsense went on, scare stories, all sorts of different things. And instead of responding to it ourselves, we simply asked the organizations that we had been working with to respond to it. And of course, they are very much more powerful in response than us, because people would say about us, well, you would say that, wouldn't you? So it was an incredibly important relationship building, which, you know, came alongside it.
I think it's probably helpful as well that you have a more, I mean, you have 4 countries, but it seems that you have a more central organization across a much larger population that isn't geographically quite spread out so far as our smaller population here is.
Yeah, I mean, as you know, in discussions with you, I have been astounded by the way Canada is set up in some ways, in terms of the difficulty about then making changes across in terms of data collection, and in terms of then interpretation of that data and then doing something about it. I can see the difficulties with that, and it makes us appreciate the fact that, you know, transplant is run across the whole of the UK, even though the NHS is devolved, the healthcare is devolved to the different countries. Transplant is still run across all of the UK, which I think is really very important, and discussions have made me appreciate that.
I think that's a major point that isn't helped by our provincial mandates for healthcare, but I mean, that's the system in Canada.
Yeah.
Just want to check in if there's any other final comments or questions. I appreciate we're approaching 1 o'clock here in Edmonton. In that case, I think we're at time, so we'll bring this seminar to a close, if that's okay. I'd just like to remind people that next week's ATI seminar, we're very pleased to host Amanda Chrysler, who will be presenting Exploring the Promise of Cardiac Rehabilitation for the Pediatric Transplant Population. And I'd also like to close by just thanking again Dr. Forsythe for joining us today and for delivering this presentation and supporting discussion after.